Ocean Ranger. Jack, are you there? Yeah. Just a second. I am requesting to tell you that we are listing badly. Those stuttering, static-choked words are from a frozen February night in 1982 were the death rattle of a $120 million Titan. The Ocean Ranger was an unsinkable fortress, a steel giant built to defy the North Atlantic's absolute fury. But as the ocean screamed, this high-tech marvel transformed into a haunting, sub-zero tomb for 84 souls, marking the deadliest offshore drilling disaster in history. How did the world's most advanced rig succumb to a chain of such impossible and terrifying failures? I invite you to walk with me through the eye of this storm until the final wave of our journey, because what happened in those final panicked moments is a mystery more haunting than any maritime legend. In 1976, as offshore oil drilling reached into new, staggering depths, the industry demanded a Titan capable of defying the world's most treacherous environments. From the shipyards of Mitsubishi Heavy Industries in Hiroshima, Japan, emerged a giant that would redefine maritime history, the Ocean Ranger. At a reported cost of $120 million, Ocean Drilling and Exploration Company, ODECO, out of New Orleans, commissioned what was then the world's largest semi-submersible platform. This mobile offshore drilling unit, or MODU, was not merely a structure. It was a $120 million statement of human dominance over the ocean. To understand the tragedy of the Ocean Ranger, one must first grasp the sheer scale of its engineering. This was a 400-foot long, 262-foot wide, and 337-foot high fortress of steel. Unlike traditional drill ships that lacked stability in heavy swells, the Ranger utilized a semi-submersible design, essentially a massive marine vessel with its hulls hidden deep beneath the waterline. It featured two enormous pontoons divided into multiple ballast tanks, controlled by a sophisticated pump room that regulated the flow of water to keep the platform balanced and upright. By maintaining a deep draft of 80 feet, the Ocean Ranger remained inherently more stable than any surface vessel, making precise drilling possible even in the most punishing conditions. It was anchored to the seabed by 12 45,000-pound anchors, each fastened with redundant chains and wire ropes, giving it a braking strength of approximately 1.2 million pounds per anchor. It was designed to drill 25,000 feet into the ocean floor in waters up to 1,500 feet deep, the very limit of the era's technology. However, with this immense power came a dangerous, creeping arrogance. ODECO and the industry at large viewed the Ocean Ranger as more than just a machine. They deemed it unsinkable. This confidence wasn't just corporate marketing. It was a belief woven into the very identity of the rig. Having weathered the brutal conditions of the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, and the coast of Ireland, the Ranger seemed invincible. By November 1980, when it arrived at the Hibernia oil fields off the coast of Newfoundland, the rig had become a symbol of triumph. This was the pinnacle of maritime engineering, a marvel of its time. Yet it was standing on a foundation of overconfidence that would soon be tested by the absolute fury of the North Atlantic. For all its advanced ballast systems and massive anchors, the most critical component of any vessel is its command. And on the Ocean Ranger, that command was dangerously compromised by a culture that placed industrial production far above maritime safety. At the heart of this brewing storm was Captain Clarence House. On paper, House held a master's license for self-propelled vessels, a credential that suggested a seasoned veteran of the sea. But the reality was far more unsettling for a rig operating in the brutal Grand Banks of the North Atlantic. For the past 10 years, Captain House had worked in non-mariner positions, distant from the bridge and the rhythmic life-or-death demands of the ocean. He was a man who had been away from the sea for a decade, suddenly thrust back into its most violent theater. Even more alarming, he had been assigned to the Ocean Ranger only on a temporary basis, arriving just 19 days prior to the fateful night of February 14th. He was, in every sense, a temporary figurehead, a placeholder in a position that demanded absolute, instinctive mastery of the vessel's unique stability systems. But the tragedy of the Ocean Ranger's command did not stop with an out-of-practice captain. It was systemic. In the complex world of offshore drilling, a dangerous power struggle often exists between the maritime side of the vessel and the industrial side of the drilling operation. On the Ranger, Otico and Mobile had organized a command structure where the tool pusher and the drilling foreman effectively outranked the captain. The tool pusher, Mr. Kent Thompson, a U.S. citizen with 15 years of drilling experience, was the senior-most Otico officer on board and the highest-ranking officer overall. His counterpart from Mobile was the drilling foreman, Mr. Jack Jacobson, a Canadian citizen with 16 years of related experience. In this hierarchy, Captain House was not the ultimate authority. He was responsible only for training, deck cargo, and general maintenance. The men who focused on the black gold below the seafloor held the real power, while the man responsible for the ship's safety was relegated to a secondary role. This culture of placing oil production over seamanship created a vacuum of safety where maritime expertise was treated as a bureaucratic requirement rather than a life-saving necessity. This lack of cohesion and technical incompetence was not just a theoretical risk, it had already manifested in a terrifying near miss that should have stopped everything. On February 6th, 1982, just over a week before the final disaster, the Ocean Ranger suddenly began to list 6 degrees to port while taking on fuel from its supply ship. In a structure this massive, a 6-degree list is significant. It is a sign that the very balance of the world is shifting. During this event, Captain House had attempted to intervene in the ballast operations, relieving the operator on duty. In a moment of sheer technical ignorance, while attempting to pump out Tank 14 to correct the list, Captain House instead switched the sea chest valve to the wide-open position. Instead of emptying the tank, he opened the gates to the Atlantic Ocean, filling Tank 14 rapidly and worsening the condition. The list became so concerning so quickly that much of the crew began prepping at lifeboat stations in a state of panic. It took the senior ballast control operator, Mr. Rathbun, being called from his bunk to identify the error, take over for the captain, and correct the valve state. They had narrowly averted disaster by the skin of their teeth just 8 days early. 8 days. The warning signs were not just visible, they were screaming. In the aftermath of the February 6th incident, Otico's shore-based drilling superintendent, Jim Counts, and the tool pusher, Kent Thompson, both agreed that Captain House was unfit for his position aboard the platform. Even Captain House himself reportedly expressed that he didn't even want to be there. Yet, in a decision that would haunt the families of 84 men forever, no no action was taken to replace him. No one moved to bring in a seasoned mariner who understood the life and death stakes of ballast control in a hurricane. Instead, the companies chose to maintain a tragically inexperienced leadership team to comply with U.D.S. Coast Guard regulations on paper while ignoring the reality of the man's capabilities in practice. They left a placeholder at the helm of the world's largest rig in the most hostile environment on Earth during the peak of storm season. February 14th, 1982. Valentine's Day. But in the Hibernia oil fields, 200 miles off the coast of St. John's, Newfoundland, there was no room for sentiment. The North Atlantic was brewing a monster. By early Sunday morning, the Newfoundland Oceans Research and Development Corporation, or NORDCO, issued a grim forecast. A weak disturbance from the Gulf of Mexico was intensifying with terrifying speed. By 1:30 p.m., the forecast turned dire. 90-knot winds and 35-foot swells were imminent, with visibility dropping to zero in freezing snow. The Ocean Ranger, alongside its counterparts, the Sedco 706 and the Zapata Ugland, prepared to weather the storm. But while the other rigs disconnected early, prioritizing survival, the Ocean Ranger held on, fueled by an arrogant history of enduring storms that sent smaller vessels fleeing. It wasn't until 6:58 p.m. that tool pusher Kent Thompson finally reported they had ceased drilling and disconnected. But by then, the ocean had already begun to find its way in. The fatal flaw of the Ocean Ranger was not its massive steel columns, but a single, vulnerable point of failure: the ballast control room. Positioned just 28 feet above the waterline at its 80-foot draft, this room was the nerve center of the rig's stability. It featured 4 glass portholes, or port lights, which were the operator's only visual gauges to monitor the draft markings on the corner columns. Each porthole was equipped with a deadlight, a heavy steel cover designed to be bolted shut during heavy seas to prevent water from shattering the glass. But on the night of February 14th, there were no standing orders to close them. Despite the hurricane-force winds and 46-foot swells predicted, the deadlights remained fully open, exposing the glass to the unbridled fury of the Atlantic. At approximately 7:45 p.m., a rogue wave of monumental proportions, estimated between 70 and 80 feet high, struck the Ocean Ranger. This wall of freezing water smashed into the ballast control room with the force of a battering ram. Port light number 4 imploded, glass shattered, and a torrent of seawater blasted into the room, drenching the delicate, non-watertight valve control panel. On the supply ship radios, witnesses overheard the chaos. Senior ballast operator Mr. Rathbun reported, "The panel is wet. Working on it and getting shocks off of it had the cover off." Tool pusher Kent Thompson's reply was chillingly nonchalant. "We'll get some guys in there and get it cleaned up. Don't get anybody injured or killed." Even as the sea breached their inner sanctum, the culture of business as usual persisted. They were mopping up glass and water, unaware that the salt water was already acting as a conductor, wreaking havoc on the electrical circuits. In the darkness of the storm, the indicator lights on the panel began to flash erratically, switching from red to green and back again. To the inexperienced crew, it looked like valves were operating or closing or opening by themselves, This was the ghost in the machine. By 9 p.m., while drilling foreman Jack Jacobson was telling shore-based supervisors that the broken port light was not causing any problems, the crew made a drastic decision. They decided to cut all power and compressed air to the console and the entire control room to prevent electrical hazards. In a properly designed system, this should have been a safe state. Without power or air, the valves are designed to fail closed, locking the ballast tanks. For over 2 hours, the Ocean Ranger sat in the dark, battered but stable. If they had simply waited, if they had trusted the fail-closed design, 84 men might have survived. But shortly before 1 a.m., driven by a desperate need to start repairs, the tragically inexperienced crew restored power and air to the console. This was the moment the tragedy became inevitable. Either by causing inadvertent short circuits or through sheer technical ignorance, the restoration of power caused the valves in the forward bow pontoon tanks to open wide. Millions of gallons of icy water rushed into the forward chambers. The Ocean Ranger began to groan as it developed a 10 to 15 degree bow-heavy list. As the bow dipped lower, the situation reached a point of no return. The list reached a degree where some investigators concluded the pumps, even if perfectly functional, were no longer strong enough to shift the water and right the vessel against the massive weight of the flooding. In a final, frantic attempt to save the rig, a crewman suggested a solution that revealed the true depth of their lack of training. They decided to use a set of brass actuating rods. These rods were never meant for operational use. They were testing tools only used during construction, left on board by mistake. When inserted into the control panel solenoids, these rods served as a way to override all inputs and force each corresponding pontoon tank valve wide open, regardless of switch states. This erroneous action was performed because none of the crew involved were experienced enough to protest the decision. By forcing the bow tanks open, they invited the Atlantic to finish what the broken window had started. By the arrival of 1 a.m. on February 15, 1982, the vessel once hailed as an unsinkable fortress of modern maritime technology had undergone a gruesome transformation. It was no longer a proud monument to human engineering or industrial ambition. Instead, it had become a dying animal, groaning piteously under the suffocating weight of the North Atlantic. The Ocean Ranger was listing a dangerous 15 degrees to the bow, its massive steel structure shuddering as mountainous waves crashed relentlessly over the main deck. The freezing North Atlantic, a predator of indifferent cruelty, was finally claiming its long-sought prize. Yet, as the physical situation turned catastrophic, a second, perhaps more damnable failure began to unfold. A breakdown of human communication and established procedure that would ultimately seal the fate of the 84 souls trapped on board. In those critical moments where every passing second was measured in human lives, the rig's command structure faltered. In a move that defies standard maritime safety logic, drilling foreman Jack Jacobson bypassed the universal emergency protocols. Instead of broadcasting an immediate, high-priority Mayday on the internationally monitored distress frequencies, which would have alerted every vessel in the vicinity instantly, Jacobson chose to make private satellite phone calls. These calls were directed to his colleagues at Mobil's shore base. For reasons that history will never truly or fully comprehend, the official distress signal was inexplicably delayed. rather than a direct cry for help. The alarm was filtered and relayed through third parties located in Connecticut and New York before it finally reached the Joint Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax. This bureaucratic detour meant that valuable time, the only currency the crew had left to buy their survival, was being squandered in a fog of corporate hierarchy and atmospheric interference. At 1:30 a.m., the final haunting transmission was crackled over the airwaves from radio operator Ken Blackmore. His voice carried the weight of the inevitable. They were heading to the lifeboat stations. The abandonment of the Ocean Ranger was not the orderly, practiced retreat found in safety manuals. It was a sudden, panic-induced plunge into a living nightmare. Evidence recovered later from the state of the bodies told a story of chaotic desperation. Some men were found in heavy work suits, some in light indoor clothes, and others in nothing but their pajamas. It is clear the crew was caught in a moment of sheer, terrifying realization that the rig was foundering. However, the Ocean Ranger was not designed to operate or be evacuated at a 15-degree list. This tilt rendered the lifeboats almost impossible to deploy. The bow lifeboat was likely already submerged or shattered by the crashing surf. The two stern boats faced a deadly, sheer drop into the churning abyss, an obvious peril even to an untrained eye. Yet, the greatest failure was not the mechanical design of the boats, but what was missing from the rig entirely: survival suits. In the sub-zero waters off the Grand Banks, the human body possesses no natural defense. Without survival suits, the most basic and crucial equipment for such a hostile, frigid environment, hypothermia does not take minutes to set in. It takes seconds. In that environment, freezing spray turns into jagged ice in midair. To enter those waters in mere work clothes or pajamas was a signed death sentence, while the rig itself would remarkably remain afloat for another 90 minutes, bobbing in its tragic, inverted state. The crew was forced into the abyss prematurely. By the time the rig's dedicated standby ship, the Seaforth Highlander, battled through terrifying 60-foot swells to arrive on the scene at 2:11 a.m., the white beacons of life preservers were already visible, dotting the dark surface of the water. But as the powerful searchlights cut through the driving snow and salt spray, the crew of the Highlander realized the true horror of the scene. The life preservers were empty. The ocean had already stripped the men from their flotation. Then, at 2:14 a.m., what looked like a miracle appeared against the void. A red flare streaked into the black sky. Against all conceivable odds, the crew of the Ocean Ranger had successfully launched one of the stern lifeboats. Captain Duncan of the Seaforth Highlander maneuvered his supply vessel with desperate legendary bravery, fighting the violent storm to intercept the small, battered craft. As the lifeboat drew closer, the deckhands on the Highlander could see the staggering scale of the survivors' struggle. The lifeboat was severely damaged, with jagged holes torn into its hull from stem to gunnel. Inside, 30 or more men were vigorously bailing out freezing water with their bare hands and helmets, while one man stood defiantly in the aft hatch, steering the boat under its own power toward the light. These men had survived the terrifying fall from the rig. They had survived the initial impact and the crushing waves. Now they were only 1,200 feet away from salvation. The rescue attempt that followed was simultaneously a masterclass in maritime courage and a tragedy of cold physics. Captain Duncan skillfully backed the Highlander stern first into the howling wind, allowing the drifting lifeboat to come toward them. At 2:32 a.m., they finally had the lifeboat alongside. Lines were thrown with frantic precision. A man in the aft hatch of the lifeboat caught a rope and secured it firmly to a handrail. Another survivor caught a life ring and attached it to the bow. For a fleeting, beautiful second, there was genuine hope that the 84 men might not all be lost. 8 to 10 men emerged from the cramped hatches, standing on the lifeboat's portside gunwale. They were so close that the rescuers on the Highlander could see the logos on their hard hats and the textures of their work vests. But these men were beyond exhausted. They were soaked in freezing brine and wearing clothing completely unsuited for the lethal elements of the North Atlantic. Then, in a heartbeat, the ocean struck its final decisive blow. A massive, rogue swell caused the lifeboat to roll violently away from the supply ship. The lines, frozen solid by the spray and strained to their absolute breaking limit, snapped like glass. Within an instant, the lifeboat capsized, tossing the men into the violent, freezing sea. The deckhands on the Highlander scrambled in a frenzy to throw more lines and launch life rafts, but the cold had already completed its grim work. The survivors in the water were instantly immobilized by the onset of severe hypothermia. Rescuers watched in silent agony as men floated within mere inches of life rafts, but were unable to even lift a finger to grab them. Their muscles had seized into stone. Their will to live was being extinguished by the North Atlantic's icy, unyielding grip. The fortress was gone, and the sea had allowed no survivors. At approximately 3 a.m. on Monday, February 15, 1982, Captain Allingham of the supply ship Norder Tor was watching his radar screen with an intensity born of pure desperation. The Ocean Ranger, that $120 million Titan, was still showing as a massive, solid blip against the chaotic clutter of the hurricane-force storm. Then, in an instant that would haunt the annals of maritime history forever, radar contact was completely lost. 2 small fleeting blips appeared briefly at the rig's last known location, presumably the inverted pontoons breaking the surface as the structure rolled, and then there was only the sea. The largest semi-submersible drilling rig in the world had vanished. Yet, in a final failure of communication, this information was not relayed to search and rescue officials until 7:35 a.m. For 4 critical hours, rescue crews operated under the false, tragic assumption that the rig was still upright and that survivors might still be clinging to its deck. But there was no one left to save. All 84 souls aboard had been claimed by the freezing, dark depths of the Hibernia oil fields. The tragedy, however, was not finished with its toll. The Ocean Ranger had sunk inverted into 260 feet of water. Its massive drilling derrick crushed into a twisted wreckage beneath its own immense weight. Because it lay with only 100 feet of clearance between the bottom of the pontoons and the water surface, it was officially declared a shipping hazard. The decision was made to relocate the wreck further out into deeper water, a process that proved to be as deadly as the sinking itself. During the relocation efforts, the rig took even more lives. 2 divers prepping the pontoons to be floated were killed in a sudden, violent explosion. Just a week later, a 3rd diver was killed when an object was mistakenly dropped from the surface above. In total, the Ocean Ranger claimed 87 lives, leaving the close-knit communities of Newfoundland and the families of the American and British crew members in a state of absolute devastation. The storm was so vast that it claimed another 32 lives from a Soviet cargo ship, the Mechanic Tarasov, just hours later. What followed was a years-long grueling investigation involving Canada's Royal Commission, the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the United States Coast Guard. As these agencies peeled back the layers of the disaster, a harrowing picture of systemic failure and corporate neglect emerged. The investigation concluded that the sinking of the Ocean Ranger was not the result of a single unpredictable act of God, but rather a catastrophic chain of human design and administrative errors. First, there was the fatal flaw in the rig's very blueprint, the ballast control room. It was positioned dangerously low, just 28 feet above the waterline, and its glass portholes were far too weak to withstand the concentrated fury of the North Atlantic. The absence of a mandatory company policy to use the steel deadlights meant that the rig's nerve center was left essentially unprotected against the elements. Beyond the failures of steel and glass, the investigation exposed a terrifying industry-wide lack of training. The crew members in that control room on Valentine's night were found to be tragically inexperienced. They did not understand the fail-closed nature of the ballast valves, nor did they have the maritime expertise required to manage a severe list in hurricane conditions. The use of brass actuating rods, tools meant only for construction and testing, never for operation, was the final desperate mistake of men who had been utterly failed by their own training programs. But perhaps the most damning finding of all was the pervasive corporate culture of Odeco and the oil industry at large. It was a culture that often operated above the law, prioritizing the relentless pursuit of oil over the fundamental principles of seamanship. They filled critical maritime roles with temporary figureheads to satisfy government regulations on paper, while systematically ignoring safety and technical competency in practice. They had treated maritime expertise as a secondary concern, a bureaucratic hurdle to be cleared rather than the very foundation of human survival at sea. The legacy of the Ocean Ranger is written in the blood of its crew and the laws that protect offshore workers today. This monumental tragedy forced a global and permanent overhaul of offshore safety regulations. It led to the absolute mandatory requirement for survival suits, the very equipment that could have saved dozens of men on that frozen February night if they had only been on board. It revolutionized training standards, ensuring that ballast control operators today are highly skilled mariners with deep technical knowledge, not just industrial technicians. It changed the command structures of rigs worldwide, ensuring that a captain's authority regarding the safety of the vessel and its crew is absolute and never again secondary to the tool pusher or the commercial demands of the oil company. In July 1985, a poignant memorial was unveiled in the city of St. John's, Newfoundland. It stands today as a silent bronze witness to the 84 men who went to work on a Titan and never came home to their families. The story of the Ocean Ranger serves as a chilling eternal reminder that no matter how much steel we forge, how much technology we develop, or how much money we spend, we are never above the power of the ocean. It teaches us that engineering without humility is a death sentence, and that even the most advanced technology is only as strong as the hands and minds that guide it. We honor the lost, not just by remembering their names, but by never allowing ourselves to forget the lessons that were bought with their lives. On the high seas, there is no room for arrogance, There is only room for constant, vigilant respect for the abyss that waits beneath the waves. The Ocean Ranger was eventually floated, towed, and buried further out at sea, becoming a permanent part of the ocean floor it once sought to conquer. But its ghost remains in every safety drill, every survival suit, and every regulation that keeps a modern sailor safe. As we close this chapter of maritime history, let us remember that the sea is a cold and unforgiving mistress, and the moment we believe we have mastered her is the moment she reminds us of our own mortality. The 84 souls of the Ocean Ranger didn't die because of a storm. They died because of a system that forgot the value of a human life in the face of a massive reward. Finally, before closing today's message, thank you for staying with me to honor the 84 souls lost on that frozen February night in 1982. If this story of the unsinkable Titan moved you, please like, share, and follow for more deep dives into maritime history. If you have a personal connection or a story about this tragedy, I invite you to share it in the comments below. Your voice keeps their memory alive. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you again in our next journey on this channel.